Hello and welcome to the AUBER Roundtable. This is your place to hear current thoughts on a wide range of economic topics throughout the year. In this session, we're focused on the economic implications of the increasingly popular opinion that we should be sourcing more domestically, or at least from a physically closer nation. The notion makes sense in the ear and looks great on the proverbial bumper sticker. We've had tremendous supply chain challenges in the past 2 years. Prices continue to rise. Surely the problem can be solved if the goods and raw materials simply didn't have to travel as far. As is too often the case, what sounds good in the ear doesn't always pencil out. Is this one of those cases? We are all about to find out. We invite you to participate today by adding your questions to the discussion through the Zoom Q&A button, which you'll find in your toolbar. To get us started today, it's my pleasure to introduce the president of AUBER, John Deskins.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to our friends on the West Coast. And of course, as James already said, welcome to this AUBER Roundtable. We're really glad to have you here, and we're really excited to put on this event. So just to step back for a second, just think about what an absolutely incredible time it is to be an economist right now. And by incredible, I mean there's a lot of stuff for us to study, not that it's good stuff, but there's a lot of stuff to keep us occupied and to keep our minds working. Here we are with 40-year highs in inflation that's being driven by incredibly record high gas prices, inflation that's being driven in part by supply chain constraints that have really wreaked havoc on the global economy in so many ways, inflation that's driven in part by labor force shortages that have emerged since COVID. Have all this chaos in this economy because of these global factors that have popped up and that have wreaked havoc on our economy. Here we ask ourselves, when is all this going to end? When are these supply chain constraints going to work themselves out? When are these labor force shortages going to work themselves out? When are the gas prices going to go back down? At the same time, we're here wondering what is the probability that the economy is going to fall into recession in the next 6 months or so? Or are we in a recession right now? Will future data reveal that? How aggressively is the Federal Reserve going to have to work to combat this inflation? Of course, we're now looking at very, very rapid interest rate increases. We see, consumer confidence that's plummeting. The reason I say this is because all of us AUBER members have to understand all these issues. We have to understand all the complexity, all the subtlety within these issues, because our constituents depend on us to educate them on all these global economic concerns. So since we have to be on top of these issues, AUBER is here in part, to help us stay on top of these issues. First and foremost, AUBER offers what I think is a really cool network of peers and colleagues and friends where we can stay in touch, we can stay connected, we can rely on each other for help when we have questions, when we have concerns, when we just need to run something by a friend, to help ourselves better understand it. Just the very network of AUBER, I think, is a really valuable resource in helping us stay on top of these issues. But furthermore, in AUBER, we want to do other things to educate, ourselves, our colleagues on these issues. We, of course, have our fall conference every year. As you may have seen just a second ago, actually, it popped up on the screen right now. Our fall conference this year is coming up October 15th through 18th, and it's going to be at a fantastic location this year, Pensacola Beach in Florida, of course, hosted by the Haas Center, our AUBER organization there at the University of West Florida. It's going to be a fantastic conference and a fantastic location. I strongly, strongly encourage you all to go and start registering for that very soon, and hope to see you there in October. But in addition to all this, of course, we have these roundtable events that we put on to also help educate you. So here we are today to discuss issues associated with deglobalization, reshoring, these supply chain constraints that I mentioned just a second ago. So with all that in mind, I'm happy to introduce our first speaker today. Our first speaker is going to be Edward Alden, or I think he goes by Ted. So Ted is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a visiting professor in the College of Business and Economics at Western Washington University. He's the author of Failure to Adjust: How Americans Got Left Behind in the Global Economy. He's also the author of The Closing of the American Border: Terrorism, Immigration, and Security Since 9/11. He's directed several CFR-sponsored independent task forces, most recently the 2018 report, The Work Ahead, Machines, Skills, and U.S. Leadership in the 21st Century. He was previously Washington bureau chief for the Financial Times and is currently a columnist for Foreign Policy. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ted. And again, thank you all for being here. Ted, thank you for being here.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, John and James. I am trusting that my video is on here, so somebody will alert me if I haven't done this properly. It's great to be here. I have been writing a lot about various causes of deglobalization, from trade wars to sanctions on Russia, and it's always good for me to be in the company of economists who really look at the numbers. And for the most part, so far, though, I think we're waiting for some pretty big shoes to drop. There is not a lot of evidence of deglobalization if one looks at the trade data. And while there are hints of reshoring, there has hardly been a stampede by companies to bring their operations back home, despite the various disruptions of the last several years. There's no one better to talk about these issues and get us thinking through different scenarios than Fred Treyz. Fred is the Chief Executive Officer and Chief Economist at Regional Economic Models, Inc., which goes by the acronym REMI, R-E-M-I. It's a leading provider of dynamic economic and demographic modeling software and consulting. He's an authority on analyzing public policies and their regional macroeconomic and population impacts. I have personally found Remy's analyses extremely valuable because they look in detail at the economic impacts of different public policy choices. Fred earned his his BA at Princeton and his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. So Fred has some great slides to share with us, and then we will open it up for your questions and comments. As James put in the chat, I think there at the outset, please put those questions under the Q&A on Zoom, and we will get to as many as we can. Over to you, Fred, and thank you for being with us today.
Great. Thanks so much, Ted. I guess you're the original TED Talk. And thanks so much for the kind introduction. I'd like to jump into this topic looking at deglobalization, and then sort of some scenarios about how we can look in a modeling context on their effects on U.S. industry sectors, regions, and the macroeconomy. So the format of this presentation will be just generally talking about deglobalization, the effects of deglobalization, and then we have several different scenarios looking at supply chain shocks and rising inflation, sort of a potential global shortage of microprocessors, and how we can look at some sort of import cost change and what effect, how that would ripple through the economy, and then finally to be able to anyway, my apologies. It's a little bit different presentation than I meant to have here. So let me talk about kind of the deglobalization context. Is that in the post-World War II era, we've been moving towards a globally integrated economy and a reduction of global conflicts. And the anti-globalization movement really began with the Seattle WTO protests in 1999. America first, and then the policy of the Trump administration, the failure of the TPP, and then Brexit. So now we have, with COVID and the disruptions created by that, which has prevented international travel with large quarantine periods in China, in Europe. Then we also have the rise of China. We have the Russia-Ukraine war, and it really represents a move away from globalization in the context of ongoing growth of international trade. So the domestic context of this is, and we're right on track with these slides actually, is that we have post-pandemic adjustment. So the economy shut down very suddenly. There was a dramatic reaction by the Federal Reserve and also by the fiscal authority. And now that we're coming out of the pandemic, it's sort of time to pay the piper for free money. So there's a lot of economic readjustment due to that. From 2020 to 2022, we had a massive monetary and fiscal expansion now, which is being reversed and pulled back on the monetary side to quell the inflationary trends. There's been a colossal disruption of economic activity from the pandemic. First quarter decline of GDP with 8.5% inflation now in Q2, so far off the Q2 GDP tracker from the Atlanta Fed was 0.9. Actually, the reading after new data coming out yesterday is 0 economic growth in Q2, 8.6% inflation. Ukraine-Russia war has worldwide implications, compounding the risk of stagflation. Now, there are some changes here, pausing the solar tariffs from Biden, evaluating other tariffs, looking at petroleum reserve sales. So there's an effort, at least from Biden, is to sort of remove some of this. Some of these tariffs imposed by the Trump administration on Chinese goods, which because that effort towards tariff and a more nationalized economic approach in the United States has been part of the inflationary issue. Okay, and then I should also state that this sort of deglobalization context, if we're talking about deglobalization, it is still in the context of an expansion of worldwide trade. Now, the IMF has downgraded their projection about how much international trade should be expanding, but we can kind of see deglobalization or globalization on two different levels. One level is the political level. And with the policy restrictions to very restrictive because of COVID of international travel, entry to China is still very heavily restricted, even though other countries are opening up. The Russia-Ukraine war is a political act. The response from Europe and the United States is also a political response, and that represents a shift towards deglobalization. But then at the same time, you also have sort of the ongoing profit motive benefits of private enterprise to expand global trade, to seek out lower cost products from other areas. So one might suggest that to the extent that that private enterprise is pushing towards globalization because of comparative advantage in the different regions, reducing the cost of the supply chain, but then politically there's a push away from globalization, which is really moving that trend towards stepping back from this increasing political and economic integration of the world. So if we look at just the war specifically in Ukraine, where there's a damage to global trade, here it is, the projection of trade going down from 4.7 to 3% fuel and food crises, and now a number of countries like India are now banning food exports. So there's a national interest in protecting the nation's own food supply, and grain and food importers such as Egypt and other African nations are really struggling to be able to cover the gap of lost imports because the grain is stuck behind mine ports in Ukraine. There's also been inflation and supply chain shocks, particularly the jump up in oil prices came about as a result of the war, and deglobalization of specific resources. Okay, so to look at this, I just wanted then to look at the economic effects on regions in the United States of an increase, just specifically in the oil price shock. So what I've done here is for a REMI model, REMI macroeconomic forecasting and policy analysis model, which is composed of a multi-regional model composed of 8 major metro areas as each is a distinct economic region, and then the rest of the US as the remaining economic region. And these are distinct regional economies that are then interacting with each other, so we can see both the regional and the national effect of this change. Now, I did a little closure for the model here, which assumes, not that it's really possible, but assumes that the Fed can adjust interest rates to be able to keep employment at the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So basically, there's been an adjustment in the capital costs. So the total effect to the US economy is a wash in terms of employment. This is able to highlight what the regional effects of this increase in oil prices have been. And we can see that all areas of the United States in this model, other than Harris County, Texas, see negative job effects due to the higher oil prices change. And then Houston, Texas, with its concentration of the oil service industry and also other oil-related activities, sees an increase in employment due to this world oil and gas price shock. And now, if we're looking a big concern about this with the increase in inflation, it's its effects on different income groups. So this shows in REMI's socioeconomic indicators module, we've shown the effect of this oil price increase on consumer prices, and this is divided into income or wage quintiles. So we see the lowest 20% on the left in the light orange, then the second 20 in the next orange, and then the turquoise, blue, and green are the highest quintiles. So we see actually that there's a higher impact on consumer prices given the basket of consumer goods and services typically consumed by the middle income groups. So the medium, third, 3 quartiles. The lowest income quartile uses some public transportation, so there's a little less gasoline intensity in their consumption. And for the highest 20%, it's a somewhat smaller share of the total consumer expenditures, so it has a less of an impact there. But what's interesting about this graph is that it's not as if the middle income groups see just a dramatically higher increase in their consumer prices. However, I think the issue with the increase in inflation for middle and lower income groups is that there's very little discretionary spending in these groups. So let's say a household in the highest quintile, when there's an increase in the gas prices, there may be sufficient savings just to draw down the savings a little bit. or there may be some discretionary spending, such as a vacation, or kind of what type of hotel you're going to stay in on a vacation. So it's relatively easier for the higher income households just to pull back on some discretionary spending in order to cover the higher gasoline price, which may be needed for a commute to work. But for the lower income quintiles, there's not much give. Rent is fixed. Food costs are already economized. So when food costs and gasoline costs and rents goes up, then it produces an enormous strain on these individuals and households, because there's just not that much spending to cut back on. So generally, the pro-globalization, anti-globalization, the pro-globalization argument is you have comparative advantage. Each country produces what they're best at. GDP increases for all. And then when countries interconnect with trade, theoretically, there's a lower chance of war and conflict, since when you disrupt international trade, when you disrupt friendly relationships between countries, it does damage to both economies. The anti-globalization argument is that you have hollowed out manufacturing in the U.S. It leaves countries vulnerable to political decisions made by other countries. And then there's a line of thought that suggests that globalization in part is responsible for widening income inequality, so that with comparative advantage, U.S. exports may be in some of the highest paid industries, like you consider design of the various Apple products is a higher paid occupation than the manufacturing, and then the designers are based in the United States with a higher paid jobs, and then lower paid workers in the United States are then competing with inexpensive exports that have been done in other countries. So and then I'll show a couple of scenarios where we can kind of test out these ideas and see how it actually works in a modeling context. So the overall effect of deglobalization is, right now, with these political actions and politically led deglobalization, is increasing, leading to a contribution towards inflation. The supply chain disruptions was a disruption in the smooth and easy flow of materials and goods across international boundaries. The gas price shock and oil price shock, to a large extent, has been driven by the war, the Russia-Ukraine war. There's specific supply shortages that we're very familiar with. And then for a simulation context, we could look at this as being a tariff, but let's just say, suppose for various reasons that foreign import costs increase for manufacturing. Now, in reality, the dollar is strengthening, so foreign import costs should become less expensive as we go forward. But if we look at the experience over the last year, let's say, these various supply chain problems have led to either shortages or, in some ways, higher import costs for foreign goods. So we'll look at a simulation. And then of an increase in import costs. And then there's a simple scenario, so there's no adjustment from the Federal Reserve. So in some ways, it's just looking at this effect of higher import costs, how it works through the U.S. economy. And we'll see that it lowers employment in the US, it lowers GDP. And the explanation for this is higher import costs lead to higher consumer prices, higher production costs for imports. The higher consumer prices lead to lower consumption, and then higher production costs for inputs lead to, they have to pass those costs on to customers. So then the final good becomes more expensive, and there's pullback in consumption, as well as when production costs go up from for firms, they may pull back on their production as well. Now there is an increase, as we'd expect, in output employment for U.S. industries that compete against these imports. So just as we might expect a tariff to work is when the cost of imports goes up, the country, the businesses that are competing internationally see a benefit. The domestic producers see a benefit because the imports are more expensive. But then as you pass all these costs through higher consumer prices and through the production chain, we see a decrease. So the first effect we see then is lower employment for the US. Next, reduced GDP. We see a higher price index, reducing personal consumption expenditures. And this was instituted as an import cost increase for manufacturers. And then we can see here manufacturing has an increase in output as it's faces less competition from the rest of the world, and the negative effects in terms of passing those costs along the supply chain, higher consumer prices and lower consumption, is distributed across all of the other industries, other than the one which actually benefits from those higher foreign import costs. And then again, we can see employment, manufacturing increases, and the other industries lose employment. And this shows employment by occupational wage quintile. So it's interesting to note here is sort of there's this narrative that cheap manufacturers from the rest of the world damage employment in the middle class occupational categories. So in this case, we've put in a higher import cost, so we could look at that as a tariff, and we've imposed it across all of manufacturing. So we put on a tariff across all manufacturing industries in the US. We've seen that increases employment for manufacturers, but because of the higher costs, it's reduced employment for all of the other industries. And then when we go to an occupational level, we see that employment across all quintiles goes down. So you might think a manufacturing worker in the United States will be in a middle income group, and the protection from the foreign import will increase their wage. However, there are many other middle income groups in the US, nurses, teachers, construction workers, and so on, so that the protection of the manufacturing worker is sort of overwhelmed by the loss of employment to all the other middle income categories of occupations. So the takeaway from here is, if we do some sort of reshoring, let's say through a tariff which reshores manufacturing, is it may be a benefit to specific manufacturing workers, but it's not necessarily a broad-based benefit to all of the, actually to any wage quintile in the economy. And this also shows employment by educational attainment. So actually those with high school equivalent or less, or some college, see some of the biggest losses in employment, even though we're helping to protect manufacturing, which and the loss of manufacturing jobs have been sort of held responsible for why those without an advanced degree have had such a hard time in the labor market. This again is from the REMI Socioeconomic Indicators module. Okay, and then I'd like to just quickly go through another scenario, which is deglobalization sort of as a potential policy option or political option with the purpose of mitigating black swan risk, quote unquote black swan risk, some sort of dramatic, unexpected event which would be massively disruptive. So we've seen over the past year that with these supply chain disruptions, that if there's a loss of a critical import, international import, like semiconductors, where we really saw that, then it could force the closure of domestic industries which are dependent on those inputs. So even with the Ambassador Bridge closed to Canada, that reduced the ability of auto parts to come from Ontario down into the United States, and forced the closure for several days of some U.S.-based auto plants. So these black swan events, I mean, I guess we could say the pandemic was a black swan event. It was completely unexpected and highly disruptive, and that these events do happen. They don't happen every year. They don't happen with frequency, but we've had 9/11. We've had the onslaught of the financial crisis. We've had this pandemic, and it seems like sort of the smooth operation in the supply chain, which is designed to minimize costs, then isn't necessarily suited if there's a severe disruption to be able to have a lot of resilience in the case of that disruption. So there could be a policy to have some more domestic content to mitigate a potential economic disruption that might happen if inputs are cut off. And from that, there's a higher cost for getting those domestic inputs, a less efficient economy, but it could be justified by reducing the risk of some disaster in the future. So what's a potential example? Some have talked about the potential for a future China-Taiwan conflict, and Xi has said the historical task of the complete reunification of the motherland must be fulfilled, and will definitely be fulfilled. So let's say we know that Taiwan supplies semiconductors to the United States. These are very critical component to the automotive industry and across many industries in the United States. Intel has recently invested $20 billion into Ohio chip factors, which would mean more domestic production. And then there's the overall risk that some of the auto manufacturers and others have felt during this last year's supply chain disruption in chip factories. So we want to look in the, again, REMI model, the REMI E3 plus model. We want to look at the resilience loss reduction potential. So the way we look at that is there are two scenarios. One is a scenario where we simulate some type of shock to the economy. And this could be with supply chain disruption, it could be looking at a hurricane that hits the coast of Florida, or an earthquake, or some other sort of catastrophic event where if there are no resilience measures put into place, an economy can be facing severe losses. Then we look at the resilience measure put into place. Often it comes at a cost. Like coastal resilience comes at the cost of you need to build dikes and barriers and strengthen bridges and having other measures. So those sometimes come at a cost. But then if there's some sort of catastrophic event, there will be avoided losses, and then we can measure the resilience loss reduction potential as the avoided losses over the maximum potential losses. And we'd like to attribute this methodology to Adam Rose out of USC, who developed this approach to looking at avoided losses, kind of in the context of all the work he's done with 9/11 and other disasters. So in our disaster baseline control, we say there's some dramatic shutdown of chips that then causes a sharp reduction in the motor vehicle industry. And the resilience scenario is to have some sort of tariff on imports of critical inputs into the automotive industry in order to encourage the domestic industry to have a domestic supply. So if there's a reduction in the international supply, the damage to the industry will be less. So here's the baseline control at some unspecified time, which we put out here, 2032, 2033. The industry faces a collapse, causing a loss in output. And the same thing for employment. And here's the disaster baseline. And then we have the resilience measure. So the resilience measure shown in green is a cost that's put on by increasing the import costs. So you have a less efficient economy from 2020 out to 2031. So the green line is with that resilience measure. It's a less efficient economy than your red line. So you have a loss of GDP. But then when you have the negative event happen, which we've simulated here to happen in 22 and 2033, the resilience scenario has much less of a loss. And then you've actually avoided, I mean, this is sort of a made up scenario here. You've avoided $1.7 billion of avoided loss due to the resilience measures. So the resilience loss reduction potential is 47.33%. So the conclusion is that, as well as other factors, COVID pandemic and the Russian-Ukraine war has really set the stage and really taken back, especially at the political level, um, uh, the trend towards sort of a globalized, cooperative world, and it's sort of taken a step back in the direction of deglobalization. Generally speaking, globalization is very efficient in terms of low cost production. That Walmart has a supply chain that stretches across the world to be able to provide low cost consumer goods and services. Yet there are certainly winners and losers from globalization. And then we also have sort of an illustration of why, in with the possibility of a fragile global supply chain, that there may be sort of a political reason to develop domestic supply alternatives to mitigate potential disruptions. So thank you very much, and we'd like to turn over to the Q&A session.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Fred. That was a fascinating presentation. Participants here, if you have a question, please put it there in the Q&A, and I will spot it. In the meantime, just a couple of things while we're waiting for questions, Fred. As you were talking, reminded me of an article that I assign to my students every year by Paul Krugman. And Krugman wrote a piece, it was an IMF collection of papers a few years back, basically asking the question, why did economists miss the globalization shock, right? Why wasn't it until the work of David Autor and Gordon Hanson and David Dorn that we sort of understood the employment impacts of allowing China into the WTO and reducing tariffs? But he concludes that article by saying that if we're looking at future shocks, there's not likely to be another huge globalization shock. India is never going to enter in sort of the scale that China did, but that the most likely scenario, in fact, was a deglobalization shock. And I just think it's fascinating in your modeling there, some of the impact on employment, for instance, for middle class workers from a deglobalization shock. So essentially the same people who got hit by a globalization shock are going to get hit by a deglobalization shock. I mean, maybe not the manufacturing workers, but in terms of quintiles, quite similar. Question I wanted to ask you just to start off and tee up others. In the resilience scenario, how should we understand that? Because politicians are talking a lot about the importance of resilience. There's this whole bipartisan, supposedly Innovation Act working its way through, which is full of expensive resilience measures. Is the correct way to read your modeling there that what these resilience measures do is they buy us some protection against these black swan scenarios, but there's an ongoing efficiency cost for the economy that we're going to absorb in various ways? Maybe just tease that out a little more, how to understand that scenario.
Well, consider the case of Europe and Germany, where there was a high level of reliance on imports of Russian gas and oil, and I'd say gas in particular because oil can be more easily shipped from other places, and then those economies became very vulnerable to almost like an inability then to respond to cut off those imports. So it's the idea is Russian gas is cheaper than any other energy supply, but then you're subject to the political whim of the Russian leadership. So there may be a basis from that. So it's one of those things that we have sort of two systems acting in parallel. One is free enterprise. Free enterprise is going to be looking for efficiency, for low cost. Walmart is known for reducing cost of the supply chain, seeking worldwide the lowest cost suppliers. So that's this push towards globalization. which comes out of all these private companies working around the world. But then you have another set of interests which come out of the political process, and there may be well, I mean, if we just look at let's say look at the banking system and the free enterprise system. Well, what happens when you have a financial crisis? The banking system hasn't developed its own internal resiliency measures, and the government has to step in. So there may be a reason to say is, okay, we have multinational corporations keeping efficiency and keeping our costs down, but are they really prepared for something like the Russia-Ukraine war or some other potential disruption?
It's a really good way to put it. I think people will be studying German manufacturing for some years now, because clearly the German industry would have been better off with resilience measures. But in the short run, of course, cheap gas from Russia gave the Germans a significant competitive advantage. So you can understand why the companies were reluctant to mess with that. We had a question that just came in from Alyssa Wood. She said, like the example of microchips, what other types of goods are at high risk of a globalization black swan event? There's been a lot of talk about microchips, but less about some other commodities. So where do you see as some of the bigger risks in terms of these black swan events?
Well, the U.S. is a food exporter and self-sufficient in food. So I think that is like top of mind for other countries. Like
Fred, you muted yourself somehow there.
Myself by accident,
Yeah,
just hit a stray button over here.
No, we're easy to do. Go ahead, continue.
So yeah, for food importers, South Korea, Japan, Egypt, Middle Eastern countries is like I think that's that's a huge concern. And now how does that hook into the U.S. economy? But that's sort of in a global context is right now with India, where there's sort of scrambling around to have the food and grain supplies. That certainly is very disruptive. In the United States, there I would say really comes to mind electronic components and technology. So that's as far as I know as really the big ones. Auto parts coming in from Canada. So the Ambassador Bridge shutdown was a shock. It was very short term, so the recovery was very easy. But generally, the U.S. is a large, diversified economy. So from a national perspective, this kind of disruption is much less of an issue than it would be for a small economy that's only self-sufficient in a couple of different industries. Hence the strengthening of the European community following Russia, because that just drives home that they're very, very mutually interdependent on each other.
Yeah, I mean, the Biden administration has been doing a lot of exhaustive studies into supply chain vulnerabilities. A couple others they've identified are rare earth materials. There's a great piece in Foreign Policy, which I also write for my CFR colleague Zoe Liu, that's up right now, looking at China's potential willingness to use the rare earth weapon, which they've done in the past, but have been reluctant more recently. And I guess medical devices is the other one, just because of the pandemic that the Biden administration's been looking at a lot of pharmaceuticals and other things. I actually wanted to ask you another black swan question. I know there were other things in your presentation, but I was wondering if we are more vulnerable to these black swan events now that we're in a high inflation environment. Because of course, if you look, at government responses to the global financial crisis in 0809 or to COVID, the basic response was to throw money at the problem in a variety of different ways. And how much does our current high inflation environment constrain that if another black swan event were to hit in the next couple of years?
I think yes, yeah, certainly, there's this feeling that the Fed's kind of running out of bullets. So that's certainly a concern here. And just more generally with the black swan is you have technology. So everybody's connected. That's very efficient. But now you have these vulnerabilities with cybersecurity. I mean, we don't keep paper records of everything. So if your website goes down and your computer's off, what financial records do we have? So it's in many different areas. We have very efficient agriculture, but it's monoculture. So that if a disease strikes, that we only have corn, wheat, rice, and sorghum producing most of the world's caloric output. So you run into that vulnerability. Global warming and weather and climate disruptions. We have droughts going on in the western United States. There's a massive drought in Africa. So I think there's kind of this tension where you have a very efficient global system, but then not a lot of resiliency. So we've seen, in the past, the Roman Empire had a very efficient imperial system where the management, of the empire and the army and all that stuff, and the food production coming in from Africa and coming into Rome. But then if there was a disruption, it all collapsed. So, I mean, it's all sort of terrifying, but I think that's a little bit of a tension when you get a very efficient, very globalized system that there's not much diversification, and you're very subject as a global system for one piece to be missing. The collapse of 1200 BC, this sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I think your phrase there. We've got a very efficient global system, but without a lot of resiliency is a very good way to encapsulate the problem. We don't have a lot of time left, and so maybe I'll just throw one last question at you before we wrap up. I was listening to an economist podcast this morning from Sumaya Keynes, who used to be their Washington bureau chief. I knew her out there. She was talking to Chris Rogers, who's the supply chain guy at Flexport. He had an interesting thing to tell you. He was talking about the cost of shipping, which have basically quadrupled and have stayed high. And what he was saying is the only way we're probably going to get out of that is the only way these bottlenecks unwind is as demand begins to decrease. So essentially a recession that could take a couple of years. So I guess I want to ask you, if we do in fact go into recession, to what extent do some of these deglobalization problems in effect start to work themselves out because demand goes down enough that some of the supply constraints get eased? Should we be extrapolating the current condition forward for the next 5 or 10 years, or should we imagine a more likely scenario is a real slowing of the global economy, which actually begins to restore a bit more balance?
I think there's a lot of I think there's a lot of economic push out there to maintain a globalized system, and China looks and sees what happens to Russia when you sort of exit that globalized world, and they can see that economic devastation that can happen to a country once you sort of check out of this international system. And then as we enter a worldwide economic slowdown, those economic pressures will mount. So I think the context of this deglobalization is things have taken a big step back. No doubt, Russia is no longer part of the international community the way it had been. The idea that you integrate Europe and Russia, and that's going to be the end of conflict, is clearly off the plate. But then, you know, but then you have these sort of the natural reasons for globalization. It's good for China's economy. It's good for the U.S. economy, despite specific sectors and certainly a lot of manufacturing towns that have really been hit very badly. But overall, it's a positive for both. And Europe has come together much more. There's no chance of anybody exiting NATO or another Brexit. The jury's still out about which way it's going to go. We hear a lot of talk about this issue, so I just wanted to lay out some of these thoughts and some of the implications to the economy to sort of help jumpstart a discussion on this issue.
Yeah, it's a good note to end on. My own background's political science, and I did a piece a while ago looking at this whole notion that interdependence reduces conflict. And you'd have to say Russia-Ukraine seems to give the lie to that. But on the other hand, your point about how high the costs are, and the Chinese and others have to be looking at the price the Russians are paying and thinking, do we really want to go down this disruptive road? James, I'm going to turn it back to you here for the wrap up.
Yeah, no, this is great. I want to thank you both, Ted and Fred. This was a great discussion, and I hope everyone enjoyed this as much as I have here. I want to invite everyone to join us for the next AUBER Roundtable on July 28th for another fantastic discussion. Watch your email on the AUBER website for more information as that comes out in the next couple of weeks. Today's presentation will be made available on the AUBER website as well, and we encourage you to visit www.auber.org to learn more about our annual conference and email discussion platform. And then finally, from all of us at AUBER, thank you for attending today. We hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks very much.